Good afternoon. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper that I'm working on with a colleague of mine as well as a team of 4 undergraduates. Katie just noted that I'm the Director of Undergraduate Research at USC. And what we're doing is a qualitative replication to help us better understand, in this case, the resource curse, the connection between natural resource wealth and the incidence of civil war. So this is a little bit different from what you guys have been hearing about today, but qualitative research is a useful way to study causal mechanisms, which I think all of us in this room care about. And particularly in cases when we aren't able to perform experiments or doing observational work, it can really fill out our understanding of the connections between our independent variables and our dependent variables. But despite movement towards replication, few qualitative replication studies exist. I would argue that the problem behind this is because they're incredibly labor intensive. You need to go through stacks and stacks of paper, government reports, books, all sorts of things in order to recreate the process of building a case study. And so what my proposed solution is to use team-based research in order to review these materials and hopefully be able to confirm or disconfirm codings of qualitative work. Right, so this is my research lab, the Security and Political Economy Lab. It's a select group of students chosen from our 850 majors. And we had a team of 6 students that worked on the replication over the last 6 months. So what we wanted to do to see if we could make this team-based replication work is we approached a fairly influential article in the literature on the resource curse. It's by Michael Ross, a political scientist at the University of California, Los Angeles, and was published in 2004. Since then, it has had roughly 1,000 citations. So it is fairly kind of well integrated into the conversations about causal mechanisms in this particular area of the literature, and making it particularly ripe for replication. So basically, what Ross wants to know, just to give a little background on the paper, is to better understand how resources influence civil war. And the understanding is that there's probably multiple pathways by which this happens, but there is no real consensus on what the exact mechanisms look like. So previous work that he is responding to believed or suggested that the connection between resources and civil war was either a product of greed, meaning that individuals were motivated to rebel because they wanted to get material wealth, or grievance because the individuals had some sort of grievance or anger at the government. And what Ross is trying to do in his paper is kind of take away that sort of binary understanding of the causal mechanisms and suggest perhaps that those are not the only ones, and perhaps not even the most important ones. So what he ends up doing in this article is a sort of pseudo-meta-analysis looking at 13 proposed mechanisms that have been mentioned within this literature, and hoping to understand where we can see these particular mechanisms at play. He does this by using 13 most likely cases. He calls them most likely because these are cases in which have the greatest concentration of natural resource wealth as measured by resource exports as a percentage of GDP. So how important is it to the state's economy? The idea that in those areas in which it's the highest, you're going to be more likely to see these mechanisms at play. So he's setting himself up to be able to kind of view these mechanisms, so to differentiate between individual variants. So that's the background on the paper. How did we go about doing the replication? Well, one of the first tasks that we had to do was determining the coding criteria. And this is actually fairly difficult because when you have a quantitative study, there's frequently a code book that you can reference and you can go back and look at why decisions were made. But with case study research, you don't have that sort of information, right? So what we did is we reviewed the article, the hypotheses, and the types of evidence that was referenced within the text to get a feel for sort of Ross's idea of how I know it when I see it. And we sort of backwards inducted a code book from that, which is going to be available as part of the materials that go along with this article. We also went about collecting all of the sources that Ross cited within his article, so we're only using materials that he used to be as fair as possible to the replication. Although I should note that this, as I mentioned earlier, this is a big sort of time-consuming endeavor. Not only do we have 13 hypotheses and 13 cases, but we also had to use more than 60 sources to review in terms of information about the case studies. We were also very, very lucky in that Ross was fairly generous with his time. My team had the opportunity to meet with him for several hours, and he answered virtually all of our questions about sort of the process of working on this paper, and was generous in sharing his case notes with us. So not only were we using the same materials, but we were also using Ross's case notes in order to try to recreate his understanding of the cases and where he saw those dynamics at play. So once we had all of those pieces in place, it was time to do the replication. Each of the individual cases was coded by 2 independent coders on the team, and most team members were responsible for either 2 or 3 of the cases included in the 13. And when they reviewed all of the materials, they were to keep in mind the 13 hypotheses that were indicated by Ross and categorize each as either confirm that they agreed with Ross's coding of that particular hypothesis in that case, disconfirm, in which they were asked to indicate whether they found it to be a false negative or a false positive. And then we also allowed for a category of ambiguous. This was particularly necessary because there was no code book, and it frequently happened in cases in which, in order to positively reference that a mechanism was at play, Ross frequently required that both the independent variable be present, but also that it have the intended effect. Right? So there are cases in which we were sure that the independent variable was present, but the evidence that he had used to determine whether it had had an impact on the war in some way was much more difficult to parse. And so some of these were left as ambiguous. Just to give you an overview of the findings that we had, basically 1 in 4 of Ross's codings we were unable to replicate. This is a breakdown. The orange is the disconfirmed, which is roughly 15% of the codings, and 10% of the codings we determined to be ambiguous. I also mentioned we broke this down into false positives and false negatives. So the orange to your right is the false positives. So these are the cases in which he said a mechanism was there, but we found that it was not. And then the majority of these were actually cases in which the mechanism was in place, but he did not recognize it. So what does that mean in the real world? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples that are related to Ross's causal mechanism that relates natural resource wealth and how it creates incentives for individuals to go to the bargaining table and reach a negotiated agreement. So I'll give you an example of a false positive and then a false negative. So for a false positive, we would imagine that this would be a case in which there were natural resources involved in a negotiated settlement, and then we found that it was not. And such was the case with the Republic of Congo that was engaged in the Civil War in 1997. Ross said that the negotiated agreement here was based upon natural resource understandings. Unfortunately, The war did not end in the year that he said it did. It actually lasted for 2 more years, and which is a time period that's well within the study. And also, the war ended with a military defeat. There was no negotiated settlement at all. Right? So there's no way that natural resources had an impact on a negotiated settlement. That didn't happen. In terms of a false negative, we can stay in the year 1997 and stay in Africa. We can look at the civil war in Sierra Leone. In discussing the 1997 Lomé peace agreement between the Revolutionary United Front and the Sierra Leone government, Ross noted that the peace agreement had nothing to do with natural resources. This is a very strange suggestion, given that one of the stipulations of the peace agreement was such that the members of the revolutionary, or representative of the Revolutionary United Front, was to be granted control in the Ministry of Interior and also to have a role in the control of mines in the country, which were a major source of the discord between the groups during the conflict. So we coded this as a false negative. It was certainly the case that natural resources had something to do with that negotiated agreement. So that gives you an idea of kind of what that coding process looked like and our overall findings. But something that we really want to know is not just what's the average rate of confirmation or disconfirmation, but we're also interested in whether or not there's systematic bias. So I'll be showing you the breakdown both by hypothesis and by case. We'll start out with hypothesis. So lots of bars here, but what you really need to know is each of these represents a hypothesis. The dark blue is the proportion of the cases that we were able to confirm. The orange is the percentage that we were disconfirmed, and the gray are the cases that were deemed ambiguous. So overall, there's no hypothesis that we were able to completely confirm, although there's variation amongst those hypotheses in terms of our ability to replicate them. But what about greed and grievance? What about these hypotheses that Ross was really reacting to and was trying to dismiss in some ways? Well, if we look at this and we exclude all the others to only include the greed and grievance measures, we find that actually these are 2 of the hypotheses that had the worst replication rate. And so perhaps Ross was overextending in the claims that he was making about the role that these mechanisms had. And indeed, we found that they were more prevalent than he suggested. But it's not just those particular hypotheses as well. There's also some issues related to others. In fact, the hypothesis that had the most disconfirmed cases is actually one about intervention. This is a hypothesis that's considering the role between natural resources as being sort of a motivator for neighbors or other countries to intervene and get involved in a particular country's civil war. And so here is the isolated bar for that. You note roughly 30% of those cases we were directly disconfirming. And this largely relates to some difficulties in Africa again. Particularly during the 1990s, there was a lot of intervention going on between African states, particularly in Western Africa, with Charles Taylor on the left, who was intervening in Sierra Leone and areas around the Mano River Basin because of its natural resource wealth, and Mobutu Sese Seko on the right was kind of the main character in the African World War. The conflict in the DRC also involved 8 other countries, so to say that intervention was not happening rampantly in these particular set of cases is to not consider a lot of these interventions that were taking place. Okay, so that's hypotheses, thinking about each of the causal mechanisms that were put forward in this piece of work, but we also want to think about the cases because we'd be concerned if there are some cases that are systematically less reliable than others. And unfortunately, that is the case. Actually, the case-by-case analysis ends up looking less favorable to Ross than the by-hypothesis analysis. We have, this here is Angola, this is Liberia, and those are two of the most disconfirmed or ambiguous cases. And so, once again, some issues going on with the African cases. In those cases, we were unable to confirm roughly 60% of Ross's codings. Make sure the clicker still works. I think that's what I tried. Oh, I think the batteries were incorrect. Yes, excellent. But the one that we might be most concerned about here is over on the end. This is the Sudan. Okay, thank you. This is the Sudan, and we were unable to confirm 70% of Ross's codings for this particular case. This is quite problematic, right? Because as many of you know, the Sudan is an incredibly important case. It's still ongoing today, and natural resource wealth has been a major driver in that conflict now that's engulfing two countries. And so this kind of ties back to the importance of understanding these causal mechanisms, not only for our own understanding and knowledge, but also in terms of how we might inform policy with the knowledge that we have. And if we're basing our recommendations on flawed research, that's going to be problematic. So to summarize, there's a lot going on with this paper and a lot of material we had to go through, so I wanted to make sure that I just sort of gave you the highlights. But we found that 1 in 4 of Ross's codings did not replicate, and that there was systematic bias across hypotheses and cases. And this is particularly the case in terms of the greed and grievance mechanisms, which he noted and dismissed as part of the main takeaway of the paper and the thing that he wanted political scientists and other conflict researchers to take away. In fact, there are subsequent articles that I've read that cited Ross and say, oh, well, we know greed and grievance doesn't matter anymore because Ross said so. Right? And so this is bringing that into question, and perhaps there's further need to reevaluate some of these causal mechanisms in a more careful fashion, in a more transparent fashion. And that's what is next for this particular project. So largely the steps are going to be to sort of recreate and expand the project that Ross began. First of all, is to develop a rigorous coding system and code book. This is important just for transparency's sake, but it's also important because we had so many ambiguous codings, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Ross was unclear in his decision-making process. We're hoping that if we're able to be more explicit, those cases will be sort of rectified and won't be a question mark. We also like to expand the number of cases within the sample. While 13 is a large sample for a qualitative study, I think the possibility is that we can use teams to help facilitate this type of research and make it more feasible for researchers. We're also a little bit concerned about the case selection, right? I mentioned at the beginning that he chose the most likely cases, the cases that had the highest concentration of resource wealth. But we might be concerned that what if it's the case that there's a curvilinear relationship between natural resources and civil war? And so it might be more fortuitous for us, or useful for us at least, to look at these cases in the middle and not only those at the extreme right tail. Also be making use of better measures that we now have of natural resource wealth dependence that just weren't available at the time that Ross was writing this. And once again, this is going to be a team-based effort. I'm forever grateful to my undergraduates who have worked very, very hard on this project for the last 6 months, and they're very excited about continuing to do the expansion and learn more about these causal mechanisms, gain expertise about particular sets of cases, and help improve our overall knowledge about qualitative research and about causal mechanisms specifically. So thank you very much. There's my contact information and information about my lab if it's of interest, and I look forward to your reactions and questions. Do you want my mic?
Oh, yeah. Let's share. Thanks so much for that. I really have two questions. One is, you brought out some of this at the end, but what are sort of more general lessons for replication qualitative research? And some of that came through, but I wanted to get some big picture reflections. And then the second one is, you said there was sort of 75% replicability of the claims made, and there was some sort of ambiguity. There was, maybe another 10% was ambiguous coding. So is 75 to 80% or whatever it is replication of claims high or low? That sounds pretty high to me for replication of qualitative claims. But I want to know your take on that. Is that higher or lower than you expected? And yeah, just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so the first one about sort of how we might think about qualitative replication. Oh no, did I turn it off? There we go. Excellent. I think that in some ways, you need to have this amount of labor to deal with it, right? In terms of some of the false positives that we found, that almost felt like fact-checking. But when you're talking about false negatives, trying to find things that other researchers overlooked, that's a lot more difficult, right? And so depending on the types of errors that you might expect happening within the project, we might approach that in a different way. But I think that this is especially important in sort of case study research, right? I was talking to some psychologists earlier, and they were talking about their understanding of qualitative research as being interviews and things like that. And I know that there might be some privacy concerns with that type of qualitative research. But when you're using sort of government documents and things like that, that are relatively accessible, especially now with digitization of those types of things, I think there's real possibilities for kind of working through these materials and doing so in a systematic manner, and wanting to make sure that we get our facts straight and that we agree on interpretations of particular events. And we've seen this happening a little bit. There's a qualitative data repository now, run out of Syracuse University, if you weren't aware of it. They've also been sponsoring workshops on using a program called Hypothesis to help annotate qualitative work, in which the author is able to provide sort of additional notes to the audience as they're reading, to help kind of add context to this type of information that we might want to know about a decision-making process and an analysis process that can frequently be opaque, right? And so I think that's, we were really lucky we had his notes and things like that, so we were able to better get into his head, and that's not necessarily going to be the case unless people are more transparent. And in terms of kind of what my expectations were going in, I feel like I should have recorded it beforehand, but I don't know what my expectations were initially. This was actually a class project, and I just wanted to see what happened. But when we kind of figured out, oh, there's maybe something here, we decided to expand it into something bigger. But I think the thing that surprised me most was some of the kind of obvious misses and some of the kind of the disparities in the cases. Because I know obviously nobody's perfect, but it was kind of troubling when you see the breakdown of cases that were 60% disconfirmed or 70% disconfirmed. So that's where I have a little more, and there's always going to be some error, right? Because people's interpretations are different, or more information comes out, with new documents being released or something like
So I'm curious if, so I really like this team-based approach using undergrads, but I'm curious if either your team or if you know if his team blinded the coders to the hypotheses, and then there's be some tension, I think, in using undergrads and doing that. So on the one hand, you want to blind them to the hypotheses because his coders probably, whether he was doing it or he had researchers doing it, they're going to be motivated to try to, to code in a way that helps to support what he's trying to argue. And then, your coders, if they know what they're trying to debunk, it's just human nature that you kind of do that. So it's sort of like blinding in any kind of, like in an experimental trial or something. But then, on the other hand, when you're using undergrads, you want to really mentor them and talk to them about the research and the theory and, what the hypotheses are. And so I don't know. I'm just curious if your team was blinded, or if his team were blinded, or if even that's sort of a recommendation in coding.
So my understanding of his process is that this was just him, and he had one RA that I believe did the Peru case and really sourced it. You can tell it was the work of an RA because it had 29 sources to back it up. Wanting to get it right. But no, before going on this project, our students were not blinded. They had studied the article in depth, right? So that does, kind of track people to look for those issues. But what we tried to do in terms of trying to get some intercoder reliability, we had each of the cases coded by 2 people, and then any time that there were difficulties, we have weekly meetings where we discuss their codings, I review their codings, and if they had questions about ambiguities, we would discuss them as a group until we came to a conclusion. And so there were checks involved, but that's not necessarily going to deal with the problem that you point out.
We can take one more question.
What does Ross say in response to the ambiguities or to the contradictions? I mean, he presumably knows the case.
Yeah. That's a good question. So I think a lot of these problems were related to the way that he set up the hypotheses, and the fact that they kind of stated a particular direction and effect that some phenomena would have, right? So he was looking at, for example, looting, but in order to say that the causal mechanism was in place, the looting had to affect the length of the war. And how do we know that it actually affected the length of the war? And his justifications frequently seemed sort of arbitrary from case to case, and not necessarily indicative of some sort of kind of constant measure or understanding of what constitutes presence of a mechanism. This gentleman over here, you had had your hand up for a while.
One often sees, or at least in my experience, and sort of within disciplines that the more qualitative work tends to adopt a more adversarial approach to the way inference is related to this, I think, question. Right? You sort of had this goal of being somehow neutral, but an alternative would be, in fact, to set up adversarial teams like lawyers would in a courtroom and come to some judgment on that basis where you're actually harnessing the incentives and people are selectively harvesting information, but it's being sort of countered by another group. So, I guess the question is, what do you see the value of your approach relative to if you had sort of done this as a class project, you set it up as a series of adversarial relationships, would it have worked? Would you come to the same conclusions, do you think, or something quite different?
I really like that, and now I kind of want to try it. But yeah, I think for the most part, we would have come to the same conclusions because of the sort of group review that happened regularly, and it actually got pretty adversarial frequently, with the different students feeling fairly strongly about one way or the other. But I think that's a really interesting idea in terms of having like a red team, blue team, and seeing how we could kind of use that as a mechanism for adjudicating. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.